Have you ever heard words so simple, yet so devastating, that they could shatter the heart of a man who had everything? Imagine a billionaire, a man who owned skyscrapers that kissed the clouds, fleets of cars that purred like lions in estates. That stretched further than the eye could see, suddenly silenced by a child's fragile voice. That night, as crystal chandeliers bathed the grand dining hall in golden light, a little girl appeared at the edge of his world, trembling in the shadows, her small hands clutching her worn dress. She looked at the long table, overflowing with food that most people could only dream of, and with eyes that carried both hunger and humility, she whispered, "Can I eat with you?" The fork slipped from the billionaire's hand. He had been asked for millions, begged for empires, even courted for his power, but no one had ever asked him for something so achingly human. She wasn't asking for riches. She wasn't asking for gifts. She wasn't even asking for a future. She was asking for a seat, for a moment of dignity, for the warmth of being seen as someone who belonged. And in that moment, the billionaire's world, built on money and dominance, cracked wide open. He stared at her, unable to speak. As the echoes of her question danced around the cold marble walls, the dining hall, which just moments ago had been alive with the clinking of silverware, the soft hum of violins playing in the background, and the chatter of high society guests, suddenly felt unbearably silent. Every sound seemed to fade, as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for his answer. She took a hesitant step closer, her bare feet making no sound on the polished marble, but her presence screamed louder than anything he had ever experienced. The billionaire, a man who had conquered industries, who had bought and sold entire cities with the stroke of a pen, found himself utterly defenseless against a child's plea. He had always believed power came from control, from never letting anyone see weakness. Yet here he was, his chest tight, his throat dry, his heart pounding as though it wanted to escape the cage of his ribs. The girl's eyes flickered toward the food. Platters of roasted lamb glazed with honey, golden bread steaming fresh from the oven, fruits flown in from lands oceans away, their colors too bright to be real. She didn't lunge for it, didn't cry, didn't beg. She only stood there, silent, waiting for permission to exist at the same table where kings and queens of commerce had feasted, and that dignity, that quiet strength in the midst of her hunger, pierced him more than any desperate cry could have. For a brief second, memories he had buried long ago clawed their way back to the surface. He remembered a boy who once sat outside, a bakery stomach growling, watching others bite into loaves he couldn't afford. He remembered the shame of being invisible, of being the one people walked past as though he wasn't even human. He had vowed then that he would rise above it. All, that he would build a fortress of wealth so high that hunger would never touch him again. And he had succeeded. But now, staring at this little girl, he realized he had forgotten the taste of humility, the raw ache of longing for something as simple as bread, shared with kindness. His fingers trembled as he set down his glass of wine. All eyes in the hall were on him. Now the elite, the powerful, the privileged. They watched with polite curiosity, their smiles thin, their eyes sharp, wondering what the billionaire would do. To them, she was nothing more than an interruption, a blemish in their perfect evening. But to him, in that fragile moment, she was the only truth that mattered. The billionaire rose slowly, the chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that echoed like thunder. The girl flinched as if expecting rejection, perhaps even punishment for daring to cross into a world not meant for her. But instead he walked toward her, each step heavy with the weight of his own unraveling. When he finally stood before her, he knelt down not out of condescension, but out of something he hadn't felt in years. Reverence. "What's your name?" His voice cracked, softer than he intended. She hesitated, her lips trembling as though the syllables themselves were fragile. "Amara," she whispered, her accent carrying a melody of places far from his marble walls. "Amara," he repeated, tasting the name as though it was sacred. And perhaps it was. For in speaking it, he felt the walls of his empire tremble. As though destiny had just stepped into his life disguised as a hungry child, he extended his hand, not as a master inviting a servant, but as a man asking permission. "Would you sit with me?" Her eyes widened, shimmering with disbelief. She looked past him at the table where food glistened like treasure, then back at him as though afraid it was a trick. But his eyes that once only knew calculation and profit now held nothing but sincerity. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and placed her tiny hand in his. The moment their hands touched, something shifted in the room. The guests exchanged glances, whispers curling through the air like smoke. Some sneered, some looked away, but none could deny that they were witnessing something far greater than wealth or power. Bowing to the innocence of a child, he led her to the table, guiding her gently as though she were made of glass. When they reached the head of the table where his seat of authority stood, he pulled out the chair beside him. The musicians faltered, their bows trembling against the strings, unsure if they should continue. The billionaire nodded once, and the music swelled again, but softer now, almost reverent. As though the violins themselves understood they were playing for a moment of destiny, Amara climbed into the chair, her legs dangling above the floor. The servants stood frozen, unsure whether to protest or obey. The billionaire looked at them with a single glance that silenced all doubt. He then reached for the platter nearest him, broke a piece of bread, and placed it gently on her plate. "Eat," he said, his voice trembling, not with command, but with compassion. For the first time that night, Amara smiled. It was small, hesitant, but radiant, like the first light of dawn breaking through endless night. She picked up the bread with trembling fingers, held it as though it were the most precious thing in the world, and took a bite. The billionaire watched, his throat tight, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't shed in decades. In that simple act, he saw the truth. He had spent his life feeding his greed, but tonight, for the first time, he was feeding his soul, and deep inside, a realization began to burn. His child hadn't just asked to share his food, she had asked to share his humanity. And he, a man who had everything, yet felt empty, was finally beginning to remember what it meant to be human. But neither he nor Mara knew then that this moment was just the beginning, that the question she asked would unravel secrets buried deep in his past, ignite wars he never expected, and lead him to a choice that would change both of their lives forever. The dining hall had changed. Not in its appearance. The chandelier still blazed, the golden cutlery still gleamed, and the polished marble still reflected the light like liquid stars, but in its essence. For years it had been a stage for excess, for performance, for the display of power. But tonight it felt like something sacred. A temple where a child's first bite of bread was holier than any prayer whispered in silence. The billionaire sat motionless, watching Amara chew slowly, her small jaw working with the patience of someone who had learned to savor every crumb. Each bite was a battle between her hunger and her dignity. She wanted to devour the food. He could see it in her eyes, but she forced herself to eat carefully, respectfully, as though afraid that finishing too quickly would make the moment vanish. The guests whispered still, their voices a mixture of scandal and curiosity. Some smirked. Behind their jeweled hands, others rolled their eyes at what they saw as a pathetic display of theatrics. A billionaire kneeling before a girl in rags. What could possibly be the meaning of this? But beneath their mockery lay unease, because none of them could deny the raw truth of what they were seeing. He had more power than any of them, yet tonight he had chosen to share it, not flaunt it. The billionaire leaned closer, his voice low, meant only for Amara. "Is it good?" Her eyes lifted, cautious, shimmering with tears she tried to hide. She nodded, "Yes, it's the best bread I've ever had." He swallowed hard, realizing that for her, bread was not an everyday certainty, not a given, but a miracle. His own childhood ghost rose up again, reminding him of the nights he had gone to bed with hunger clawing at his stomach. The nights when even stale crusts would have felt like a feast. He had escaped that life, but he had also buried it, pretending it never existed. And now, this girl, the stranger, was forcing him to confront it again. "Eat as much as you want," he said softly. "There's no limit here, not tonight." Her small hand hovered over the plate, hesitant, as though she didn't quite believe him. When she reached for another piece, her movements were slow, deliberate, like someone touching treasure for the first time. She bit into it, closed her eyes, and let out a sigh so pure that the billionaire felt his chest ache. The violinists played on, but even their music seemed subdued, almost reverent. The billionaire glanced around the table at his guests. Men and women dressed in diamonds and silk, their plates piled high with food they barely touched. For them, this meal was routine, a symbol of wealth rather than nourishment. And here, beside him, was someone who understood the sacredness of every bite, and in her presence, all their glittering wealth seemed meaningless. One of the guests, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a colder heart, finally broke the silence. "Really, Richard?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Must you? Turn your home into a charity hall. There are shelters for children like her." The billionaire's jaw tightened. Once he might have laughed off such a remark, dismissing it with charm or wit, but tonight her words cut deep. He turned his gaze on her, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of thunder. "Children like her," he repeated slowly, each word deliberate, "are the reason I built this fortune. Not so that people like you could mock, but so that people like her might one day never have to ask if they're allowed to eat." The woman flushed, her lips pressing into a thin line. The table fell silent again, the power dynamics shifting. The billionaire's eyes softened as he turned back to Amara. She didn't fully understand the war being waged in the room. She felt the shield he had placed around her. And in that silent exchange, trust began to grow. As the night stretched on, Amara ate quietly, never greedy, always grateful. Between bites, she would glance at him, as though expecting him to disappear, as though afraid this kindness was a dream. She might wake from... But he stayed, steady, watching her with a tenderness that surprised even himself. Eventually, when her hunger eased, she leaned back in the chair, her small body sinking into its vastness. For the first time, she allowed herself to smile fully, not just with her lips, but with her entire being. And in that smile, the billionaire saw something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope came with responsibility. Responsibility meant change. He poured her a glass of water, his hands gentle as though serving royalty. "Amara," he said softly, "where's your family?" Her smile faltered. Her eyes dropped to her lap, and her fingers twisted together. "Gone," she whispered. The billionaire felt a chill creep through him. He wanted to ask more, but he didn't. The pain in her voice told him enough. This child was alone in the world. Alone in a way he knew all too well. He leaned back, his mind racing. His fortune could buy anything, cars, islands, entire corporations, but it could not bring back her family. What it could do, however, was change her future. In that moment, as the weight of silence pressed on them both, he made a decision. He had never imagined making. He would not let her slip back into the shadows that night. When the guests finally left, their laughter hollow and their gossip sharp, the billionaire remained at the table with Amara. She had fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting on her folded arms, her face peaceful for the first time. He watched her, his chest heavy, his thoughts tangled. He could send her away, pretend this was just a moment of charity. No one would blame him, but deep down he knew that if he did, he would never forgive himself the rest of his life. He would hear her voice, trembling yet strong, asking, "Can I eat with you?" And he knew his answer could never be no. That night, as the mansion grew quiet, the billionaire carried her gently in his arms, her weight light, but her presence immense. He walked through the empty halls, past portraits of himself painted in power, past rooms filled with treasures that suddenly felt meaningless, and took her to the guest chamber nearest his own. He laid her on the bed, pulled the blanket over her small frame, and stood there for a long time, watching her breathe. Something inside him whispered that this was not chance. This was not coincidence. This was fate, knocking on the door of a man who had everything but had forgotten why. And fate rarely knocked twice. He turned away at last, but before he closed the door, he whispered into the darkness, Sleep well, Amara. Tomorrow everything changes. And he meant it. The night passed in silence, yet within the mansion, silence was no longer the same. It was no longer a hollow emptiness filled with marble echoes and crystal chandeliers. It was the silence of something waiting, something fragile but alive. The billionaire lay awake in his room, staring at the ornate ceiling, painted with gold leaf constellations, but his mind was far from the stars. His thoughts circled endlessly back to the small figure sleeping in the guest chamber across the Halamara. For decades he had built his empire by conquering his own past, by burying the boy who once knew hunger and loneliness. He had told himself that wealth would erase the scars, that success would prove to the world and to himself that he was no longer powerless. But tonight, one question, whispered by a girl with trembling lips, had stripped him bare. "Can I eat with you?" Those words echoed inside him like an unhealed wound, reminding him of a truth he had long silenced, that no amount of money could ever erase the ache of being unseen. Unwanted, forgotten, sleep never came. Instead, memories rose, unbidden, sharp as knives. He saw himself as a child again, shivering in the cold, clutching his knees as he sat outside a bakery, the smell of warm bread torturing him while his stomach screamed. He saw the faces of people walking past him, some glancing briefly before turning away, others pretending he wasn't even there. That invisibility had burned deeper than hunger. And in Amara's eyes, he had seen the same flame of invisibility, flickering, could not let it burn her the way it had burned him. By dawn, when the first light spilled through the tall windows, he rose and dressed without hesitation. There were meetings scheduled, contracts waiting, 1,000 urgent matters that had once ruled his days, but none of it mattered anymore. Today, he would begin something new, not as a billionaire, but as a man answering a question that had broken his heart. He walked to the guest chamber quietly, pausing at the door before pushing it open. Inside, Amara still slept, curled beneath the blanket as though trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Her face, in the soft glow of morning, looked younger than ever. Her lashes resting gently on her cheeks, her lips slightly parted as she breathed. For a moment, he simply stood there, humbled. Then he stepped closer, careful not to wake her, and set a tray on the bedside table. He had told the staff to prepare it not with exotic delicacies, not with golden dishes, but with simple things: porridge, milk, fruit, and warm bread. When the scent reached her, Amara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, confused at first, then wide with wonder as she saw the tray waiting. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, her small hands reaching instinctively for the bread. But before she touched it, she looked at him, uncertain. He nodded softly. "It's yours, Amara. All of it." She blinked, as if the words were too heavy to believe. Then, slowly, she took a bite, chewing carefully as though afraid it would vanish. He watched her again, and for the second time, his chest tightened. He realized then that this was more than food. This was trust. When she finished, she whispered, "Thank you." 2 words, simple, but they landed on his heart like a promise. He pulled up a chair beside her and sat down. "Amara," he said gently, "I need you to tell me where you've been living." Before last night, her eyes dimmed, her small shoulders stiffening. "On the street," she murmured. "Behind the shops sometimes, in the park, sometimes with other kids, but mostly alone." The words were spoken quietly, but each one cut into him. He wanted to rage at the world, to demand how it could abandon someone so small, so innocent. But he stayed calm, not for himself, but for her. "And before that? Your parents?" For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she whispered, "They're gone." He felt the weight of the word gone. It wasn't the matter-of-fact tone of someone who didn't care. It was the hollow, broken whisper of someone who had loved deeply and lost more than she could bear. He reached for her hand, his voice low. "You don't have to tell me more right now, not until you're ready." Eyes flickered toward him, and in them, he saw something fragile, fear, but also a flicker of hope. For the rest of that morning, he stayed with her, talking gently, asking small questions, offering her space to speak or stay silent. Slowly, she began to open. She spoke of nights too cold to sleep, of hunger that gnawed until she felt dizzy, of watching other children go home to mothers and fathers while she had no one. She spoke of the stares, the whispers, the feeling of being invisible and unwanted. And as she spoke, he felt his heart break piece by piece. By the time noon came, his decision was no longer a flicker, it was a flame. He could not send her back into that world, not now, not ever. He called his lawyer. "Draw up the papers," he said, his tone sharper than steel. "Papers, sir?" the lawyer asked. "Adoption," the billionaire replied. "Her name is Amara." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, cautiously, "Sir, that is a serious step. Are you certain?" The billionaire's eyes softened as he looked at Amara, who was curled up in the chair with a book one of the servants had given her. "I have never been more certain of anything. The process would not be simple." The lawyer warned him of complications, of bureaucracy, of obstacles that would take months to navigate. But the billionaire was undeterred. He had fought for empires. He would fight for her. That evening, he told Amara. Her small face froze in shock when he said the words, "I want to be your family, if you'll let me." For a long time, she said nothing, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. And finally, in a whisper so faint it almost broke him, she asked, "You mean, I won't be alone anymore?" He nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and that was when she broke. The tears she had been holding back for years finally spilled, and she flung herself into his arms, sobbing into his chest. He held her tightly, his own tears falling freely, as though his soul had been waiting for this moment. In that embrace, he realized the truth. All the skyscrapers, all the cars, all the wealth he had amassed, it was nothing compared to this, compared to the weight of a child's trust in his arms. But what he did not yet know was that taking her in would not be the end of his journey. It would be the beginning of trials far greater than any boardroom war. For Amara's past held secrets that would soon surface, secrets tied not only to her, but to him as well, in ways he could not yet imagine. As night fell again, Amara fell, asleep in his arms, her small breaths steady against his chest. He carried her once more to her room, laid her down gently, and watched her sleep. And in that stillness, he whispered a vow into the dark. "You'll never be alone again, not while I live." But even as he spoke the words, shadows stirred. In corners he could not see shadows of men who knew Amara's name, shadows of truths buried deep, shadows that would not rest until both of them faced the price of destiny. The following days in the mansion unfolded like a dream Amara wasn't sure she deserved. The grand halls, once cold and intimidating, began to echo with the quiet rhythm of her footsteps. The sound of her laughter, rare but growing in, the soft murmur of her voice when she asked questions about the countless wonders around her. To the billionaire, each sound was priceless, more precious than the ringing of coins or the closing of lucrative deals. He found himself rising earlier just to see her eat breakfast, lingering in rooms he once passed through without thought, simply to watch her explore the treasures of his world as if they were magical. But beneath the beauty of this new life, a shadow lingered. It lived in Amara's eyes, in the way they sometimes clouded over when she thought no one was watching. It lived in the silence that fell over her whenever he asked too much about her past. It lived in the way she sometimes startled awake at night, muffling her cries into the pillow so no one would hear. One evening, as twilight bled into the sky, he found her sitting alone in the garden. The roses glowed faintly under the lantern light. But Amara's face was pale, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress. He sat beside her, waiting for her to speak. After a long silence, she whispered, "They'll come for me." His chest tightened. "Do, Amara?" Her lips trembled, but no words came. Instead, tears gathered in her eyes, and she shook her head violently, as though afraid even speaking the truth would summon danger. He reached out, pulling her gently into his side, and whispered with fierce certainty, "No one will take you. From me? Not now, not ever. But though he meant the words, he could not shake the chill that followed. 2 nights later, the mansion was disturbed. It was subtle, almost unnoticeably. Unfamiliar car parked too long across the street, a shadow slipping past the gates before the guards could react. And then, one morning, Amara's name appeared in a letter slid beneath the front door. No address. No signature, just a single line written in jagged script. She does not belong to you. The billionaire's blood ran cold. He had faced rivals before, enemies who wanted his fortune, his power, his downfall. But this was different. This was not about money. This was about Amara. He increased the security, doubling the guards, installing cameras, reinforcing the gates. But none of it silenced the fear in his chest or erased the memory of Amara's whispered words. They'll come for me. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked the halls restlessly until he found himself standing outside her room. The door was slightly ajar, and through it, he saw her sitting awake on the bed. Knees pulled to her chest, her small body trembling. She hadn't seen him yet. She was staring at the window as though expecting someone or something to appear. He stepped inside, his voice gentle. Amara? She flinched, then relaxed when she saw it was him. But the fear in her eyes did not fade. Tell me, he said softly, sitting at the edge of the bed. Who are they? Who do you fear? For a long moment she was silent. Then, in a voice so faint it barely reached him, she said, The men who took my parents. The world seemed to tilt. His hands curled into fists, his breath caught. Took, he repeated, his voice trembling with restrained fury. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. They were angry. My parents tried to stop them, and they didn't come back. Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. I ran. I've been running ever since. The billionaire felt his heart shatter anew. This was no simple tragedy of poverty. This was something darker, sharper, laced with violence and cruelty. And now, those same shadows had followed her to his home. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though he could shield her from the world itself. They will never touch you again, he vowed. His voice was steady, but inside, fire roared. Whoever had stolen her family, whoever dared to think they could reach for her again, would face him now. And he was no longer just a boy abandoned by the world. He was a man who had built empires. And for Amara, he would bring those empires down like thunder. But even as he held her, a thought gnawed at him. Why her? Why this child? Why would men kill her parents and chase her across the city? What did she carry that made her worth hunting? The answer would come sooner than he wished. A week later. While reviewing security footage, one of his guards brought him an image. A man cloaked in shadows lurking near the gates. The billionaire studied the grainy photo, his eyes narrowing. Man's face was scarred, his gaze sharp and merciless. He had seen eyes like that before in the world of men who took what they wanted without conscience. The guard hesitated before speaking. Sir, we ran his face through databases. He's connected to a syndicate, dangerous people. People who don't let go. The billionaire's jaw clenched. He thought of Amara's trembling voice, her broken words about her parents. He thought of the letter slipped under his door. And he knew then this was not chance. This was war. That night, he sat alone in his study, staring at the fire. All his life he had fought battles in boardrooms and markets and courts. But this was different. This was not about wealth. This was about a child who had trusted him. A child who had asked for nothing more than a seat at his table. And if he failed her now, he would not only lose her, he would lose himself. The fire crackled. Shadows dancing across the walls, and in that flickering light he made his decision. He would not wait for the shadows to come. He would seek them out. He would uncover every secret they carried, every crime they had committed, and he would burn their empire to ash if it meant protecting Amara. And yet, even as resolve filled him, he could not shake the fear gnawing in his chest, because deep down he knew this story was larger than either of them. And the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it would become. Not just for her, but for him too. That night, before he left the study, he whispered a prayer he had long forgotten. God, If you gave her to me, give me the strength to keep her. He didn't know if God was listening, but he knew the fight had already begun. The storm came without warning, not the kind that filled the sky with thunder and rain, but the kind that swept into lives and tore them apart. The billionaire had known it was coming. The shadows had been circling, the warnings had been written. In silence and fear, but when it finally struck, it came with a violence that shook even his unshakable world. It began one night when the mansion's alarms screamed to life. The guards scrambled, voices sharp over the radios, lights flashing. Across the grounds, Amara was asleep, curled in the warmth of her new bed. But the moment the sound pierced the air, she bolted upright, her eyes wide with terror. She had known this sound before, in another life, when danger had crept into the walls of her world and stolen everything. He was at her door within seconds, scooping her into his arms. "I'm here," he whispered fiercely, carrying her as though she were the most fragile treasure on earth. "I won't let them touch you," his words were. Steady, but inside his chest a storm raged. He could see the figures moving through the gates, shadows against the floodlights. Men who did not fear wealth, walls, or consequences. Men who had come for one thing only. They had come for her. The billionaire's empire had always made him untouchable. But tonight he felt the weight of mortality, not for himself, but for the girl who clung to his neck, trembling with a fear that cut deeper than any knife. He carried her down the hidden corridor that led to the inner chambers of the mansion, a place built for safety in times of crisis. But as he placed her gently inside, her small hand grabbed his with desperate strength. "Don't leave me," she begged, her voice breaking. His throat tightened. He knelt in front of her, brushing back the tears on her cheeks. "I will never leave you, Amara, but I have to stop them before they get too close. You're safe here." She shook her head violently, clinging harder. "They always find me," she whispered. "Always." His heart nearly broke under the weight of her words. But he forced himself to stand, forced himself to believe in the strength he had built over a lifetime. "Not this time," he vowed, and stepped out into the storm. The clash was brutal. Security guards fought to hold the line as the intruders pressed in, their faces masked, their movements cold and calculated. The billionaire, though no soldier, felt the fire of rage and protection burning through him. This was not about wealth or power anymore. This was about a child's right to live, to laugh, to eat at a table without fear. Hours felt like minutes as the fight raged. But in the chaos, one figure slipped through, a scarred man whose gaze was as merciless as the night. He moved with a predator's precision, avoiding the guards weaving through the shadows. His target was not the billionaire. His target was Amara. When the billionaire saw him vanish into the mansion, his blood ran cold. He tore through the halls, calling her name every step, echoing like thunder. And then he heard it, the sound of her scream. He burst into the inner chamber to find the scarred man standing over her, his hand gripping her arm like a vice. Amara's eyes were wide with terror, but beneath the fear was a strange, almost resigned sadness, as though she had always known this moment would come. The billionaire's voice roared through the room. "Let her go." The man's gaze flicked to him, cold and sharp. "She doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice like gravel. "You don't know what she is." The billionaire stepped forward, fury in every line of his body. "A child. That's all I need to know." But the man only laughed, a sound without warmth. "She's more than that. Her parents knew something they shouldn't. They paid the price. And now she carries what they left behind." The billionaire froze, his mind reeling. What could a child possibly carry that would draw the wrath of men like this? Amara's voice broke the silence, trembling but clear. "It's the book," she whispered. The man's grip tightened, but her eyes never left the billionaire's. "My father. He wrote everything down. Names, places. What they did," he said one day, someone would find it. It would end. The truth crashed into the billionaire like a wave. This wasn't just about her. This was about power, corruption, secrets so dark that men would kill to keep them buried. And now she was the last thread holding it together, the scarred man's. Smile was cruel. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you keep your fortune, keep your life. The billionaire's answer came without hesitation. Take everything I own, but you will never touch her again, the man snarled, pulling a knife from his belt. The billionaire stepped forward, ready to throw himself between the blade and the child who had become his world. In that frozen moment, time seemed to slow. Shadows, the fear, the battles of a lifetime, all of it, converged into a single choice. And then, with a strength born of desperation, Amara bit down on the man's arm. He cried out, loosening his grip just enough for her to slip free. She ran straight into the billionaire's arms, burying her face against his chest. He wrapped himself around her, shielding her from the blade. The guards stormed in seconds later, subduing the man with brutal force. But the billionaire hardly noticed. He was on his knees, holding Amara, whispering over and over, "It's over. You're safe. I've got you." For the first time in years, tears filled his eyes. Not from fear, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing she was still in his arms. The days that followed were heavy with consequences. The man was taken away, but his words lingered. The book, the secrets, the danger, they were all real. And though the immediate storm had passed, the horizon still held shadows. But something had changed too. Amara no longer looked like a guest in the mansion. She looked like she belonged. She laughed more, slept deeper, and for the first time, when she sat at the long dining table, she did not ask if she could eat. She simply picked up her fork and he smiled, because she finally believed she was home. One evening, as the sun set in gold across the garden, she looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you for choosing me." His chest tightened, and he pulled her close. "No, Amara. Thank you for choosing me." The world was still dangerous. The fight was not truly over. But as long as she was in his arms, as long as her laughter filled the halls, he knew he could face whatever storm would come next. And deep down, he understood the truth. Sometimes the greatest fortune a man could ever receive was not money, not power, but a single voice asking the simplest of questions. Can I eat with you? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because in the next journey, we'll uncover what happens when the shadows of the past refuse to die and how love, trust, and sacrifice can change everything.